we as a collective, I do believe, are in this country being overtaken by evil, and it's being done from the inside out. I'd
Mhm.
like for you to talk to us a little bit about why do you think that the Black American community in particular are easy prey and easy targets to be overcome by this? Because I don't believe we're inferior at all, but I do believe something else has happened that has caused us to be a little bit more susceptible than others to be overtaken by this wicked agenda. Talk to us about that.
That's a great question. So, um, the thing is, one of the things that the communists figured out, and this is written in their Comintern, um, which is like a kind of convention, sort of gathering that they would have and resolve to go about different issues in different ways. And so, one of the ways in which they resolved to go about galvanizing the American Negro was through slogans, through appealing to racial differences, because it's very obvious when you look at a black person that they have a difference than white people in terms of mere complexion. And when you can convince them that they're hated because of their skin color, then you can use that as leverage to gain control. And so when you look at America's history and the history of slavery, even though not all black folks were slaves and not all white people owned slaves. In fact, the overwhelming majority of white people did not own slaves during the time slavery was legal in these United States of America. However, left to our public school system, you would think that every white person was born and the first thing they got was a pat on the hindside and a slave. But that wasn't the case. And so the thing is like, um, there's so much revisionist history, and this revisionist history unfortunately shapes the narrative, as well as the identity of many black folks in this country. I know for me, growing up, um, I had uncles who themselves were pro-black. One uncle in particular, you go into his house, he had a huge picture of Malcolm X on the wall. Next to that, he had another picture of Martin Luther King, and next to that, another picture of Marcus Garvey.
Oh, wow.
Um, and so he often talked about how, we as black folks are oppressed and all these different things. We grew up watching um, Beloved, Rosewood, Color Purple, um, all of these films that kind of reinforce this narrative. Um, Watching Roots, things of that nature. Um,
So,
Now, sorry,
well,
go
I was
ahead.
gonna ask, do you believe that? Because I was always under the impression that, oh, these movies are just they're made so that we can learn our history and we can kind of get a glimpse into what things were like. And the older I become, I find out that I'm like, wait a minute, a lot of these movies are built on falsehoods. Like they're ahistorical, they're not
Yeah,
accurate in the least
right.
bit, and they do shape our our worldviews. I know definitely The Color Purple shaped my view as it related to relationships between men and women, right?
Mhm.
Men are like Mr. Now, and I'm like, oh, I'm poor Celia, you know. Roots really had me thinking, it was just come to find out that a lot of that storyline was just made up. And
Yeah, it
that's
was
that's
concocted.
still today. I didn't mean to cut you off. I know you were trying to finish a thought. Go ahead.
No, no, you're absolutely right, and I'm glad you did. But again, watching Good Times,
Mm,
it wasn't a live show by the time I was born. It was already,
continuation.
canceled. But I remember watching Good Times, and again, these films and television shows reinforced a narrative that we are, as Black Americans, oppressed by the mere fact of our skin color. And so you grow up already kind of being tugged along in this current. And so for you to go against the current or to veer off course, that must mean something's wrong with you, or you're in denial, or you're a self-loather, or you're an Uncle Tom, or what have you, because
Right.
you are challenging a lot of the the things that have already been established before I was born in terms of pushing this narrative. And so what I was able to do again is trace the narrative back to Soviet Union Communist Party, where again they devised these plans to peddle and disseminate these slogans, to peddle and disseminate this feeling of anger and hostility in the minds of Black folks. Again, as we demonstrate in Uncle Tom 2, um, communists had a very tough time pitching such a message to Black folks for the first half of the 20th century. And the
Mm,
reason they had a hard time is because Blacks, especially in the South, were church going Christians. And it
right.
was their faith, not their Blackness,
Come
but
on.
their faith that kept their families intact, that kept their men strong and people of integrity, that kept their children respectful and all the things. And not only that, but there was a lot of racial harmony between Black and white in the South. Another thing that the historians don't talk about, either because they don't know or because they're trying to peddle this narrative that keeps people divided. There's a speech that Manning Johnson gave in the late 1950s. You can find it. It's called Manning Johnson's Farewell Address. And in it, he talks about the communist plan and how they reopened wounds that have long since healed between Black and white in the South. They needed this racial tension. I found evidence also of communists burning down Black churches, burning down Black businesses, and framing white Southerners, framing the Ku Klux Klan to, again, keep this hostility alive. And not only that, communists themselves were at times active in the KKK and provoking the KKK because they wanted to create tension between Black and white in the South. They had a
Right.
very tough time doing it. In many cases, they were found out, not all. But one of the premier groups that was pushing this kind of hateful message of animosity to Blacks in America prior to the 1960s was the NAACP. Now, the NAACP was a northern organization out of New York. And there was a disconnect between New York Negroes and Southern Negroes.
Mm,
And the northern Negroes, the NAACP had a hard time, pitching the NAACP to the South because their premises were completely different. James Weldon Johnson, W.E.B. Du Bois, uh, um, I forget the other one.
A.
The
Philip
other,
Randolph? No,
yeah,
that was
A.
the
Philip Randolph, A.
mhm.
Philip Randolph as well. Um, but there was another one. His last name was White. He was one of the leaders of the NAACP as well. They were all atheists. They all did not believe in God. They were all intellectuals as well. They considered themselves a part of the talented 10th. In other words, they believe themselves to be the small few who's going to save the masses of Black people. So they consider themselves to be a kind of God to the Black race. And they believe
Right.
that they're going to save the Black race through intellectualism, not through this kind of religious quackery. And they look down in a kind of snobbish way at Southern ministers, and they especially look down on Booker T. Washington.
Right. Who's
And
my hero?
again,
Like, that's
yeah,
that he is
mine too.
that dude. Absolutely
Mine
love.
too. Yeah,
Right.
absolutely. So for that reason, there was this large disconnect between the NAACP and the South. Now, one of the things that they were able to figure out is that if we are going to be effective in the South, we need to do so with someone who is from the South.
Ah.
In comes Martin Luther King. Now, Martin Luther King was born and raised in Atlanta, Georgia.
Mhm.
His father was Martin Luther King Sr., Michael King Sr., who was the lead pastor at Ebenezer Baptist Church. So Martin Luther King, young Martin Luther King Jr., grew up with a front row seat to the oratory skills of his father. He learned about the ebbs and flows of the Black church,
Mm.
and he learned how to be effective in terms of speaking and communicating within the Black church. If you look at his papers, his own papers about his own life, he wrote that by age 12, he had already rejected the deity of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. So he didn't believe in Christ. He thought very much about his own intellectualism and about his own brilliance. And he always believed himself to be the smartest person in the room. He graduated high school at age 15 and went off to Morehouse. And he then went to Crozer Theological Seminary and other colleges. And he was a part of like a Marxist organization where he was trained. He believed in Marxism. He read the Communist Manifesto while in college. And so by the time he took his first preaching job in Alabama, he had already believed, again, in Marxism, at least from an economic perspective. And he disbelieved in the deity of Christ and the resurrection of Christ. So this is the young Martin Luther King that we're talking about. In fact, whenever he transitioned from, I think it was Crozer to Boston, in the recommendation letter from one of his professors at, I think it was Crozer, and I wrote about this on my website, and I think I even cited it on my website, but his professor says, you know, who, by the way, the professor considered himself to be a critic of the Bible. And this was a theologian, a self-described theologian. And he also was he believed in the social gospel and he believed in Marxism. But he said of Martin Luther King that this is precisely the Negro who can take our message into the South, and he can do the thing that other Black pastors have been unable to do, right? And so what is it that he's talking about? You know, so by the time he goes to Alabama, one of the very first things that he do is he gets involved with the Montgomery bus boycott. That was successful. He links up with Bayard Rustin, who himself was a communist. He then links up to Stanley Levison, who was a communist and who was the treasurer of a communist front group in New York. And he instantly becomes popularized again by the white liberal media. He's on the cover of Life magazine. He's talked about in the New York Times. He's plastered all over the place, being pushed as this is the new Negro, says the New York Times, who can take intellectual dynamism to the South. These are the kind of things that they said about him. So they were trying to popularize him. And so he didn't get this instant success and popularization among Black people in the South, but he was able to get it ultimately. He was able to get it gradually. He was able to convince a lot of these Black Southern churchgoers, especially women, to take to the streets and to march, because the communists understood that if you can create this optic of Black churchgoers being brutalized by the police, you can start and spark a movement. And they were successful in doing that. And so all that to say that the communists were not as effective as they were. They were not as effective before the popularization of Martin Luther King, because you didn't have somebody from among the Black churchgoers in the South being risen up artificially to echo this message of Marxism under a different name to the Blacks in the South to finally and ultimately go along with it. And so this is yet again another way that we were duped.